The ice closed in from both sides at once, and there was nowhere left to turn the ship around. It was the first week of February, 1898, and a small steam whaler named Belgica was pressed into a channel barely wider than 3 of herself, laid end to end. On the bridge, Adrien de Gerlache, a Belgian naval officer with a thin beard and thinner nerves, watched black cliffs rise on both sides of his ship, so close he could hear his own engine bounce back off the rock. Ahead, the water narrowed further still, choked with broken ice the crew had never seen a name for. Chunks the size of houses, drifting in a current nobody on board could predict. Behind him, the open sea. Below him, water whose depth he could only guess, because no one had ever charted it. He gave the order to keep going. Nobody on the Belgica had sailed this passage before. Nobody had, full stop. 3 weeks earlier, the ship had become the first vessel in recorded history to cross into these waters at all. And now de Gerlache was pushing his crew and his rented Norwegian whaling hull into a gap in the Antarctic peninsula so tight that the mountains on either side seemed to be leaning in to watch. He named it. In the hurried way expedition leaders name things when they are more worried about survival than posterity. After a friend back in Belgium who had never set foot anywhere near Antarctica. Then he sailed through it, because the alternative, going the long way around, cost time his ship did not have. 3 weeks later, still working south along that same coast, the Belgica would be locked into pack ice for good, the first ship in history to overwinter in the Antarctic, its crew scattered by scurvy and by something closer to madness, not freed for 13 months. That gap in the rock is the Lemaire Channel, and it is still, more than a century later, the passage that Antarctic captains argue about more than any other stretch of water on the peninsula. Not because it is the coldest place on the continent, or the windiest, or the one with the worst storms. It is dangerous for a stranger reason, because it is narrow, because it is beautiful, because ships keep choosing to enter it anyway, and because the exact nature of what makes it risky turns out to be harder to pin down than you would expect. Some of what threatens a ship in that channel is measured and known. Some of it is not known at all, not in any complete way, not even now, and that gap between the two is what this is really about. So let's be precise about what we're claiming, because most dangerous is a phrase that gets thrown around a lot in places that are mostly just cold. The Lemaire Channel is not the deadliest body of water near Antarctica, if you're counting shipwrecks and lost lives, not by a long way. The Drake Passage, the stretch of open ocean every ship crosses to reach the peninsula in the first place, has swallowed more vessels and more sailors than anywhere near Lemaire ever has. Through pure open water violence, through waves that build across thousands of kilometers of uninterrupted fetch and hit 60-degree south latitude with nothing to slow them down. Lemaire isn't that kind of dangerous. What makes it the most dangerous maritime shortcut into Antarctic waters is a narrower, sharper kind of risk. It is the passage where a normal working ship with a competent crew, following an accepted commercial route, is most likely to find itself with no good option left, boxed in by ice, rock, wind, and water in combinations that even modern radar and modern charts still cannot fully predict. It's the place where the danger isn't a storm you can see coming. It's a decision made in real time with incomplete information by a person standing on a bridge who has maybe 90 seconds to get it right. To understand why ships accept that risk at all, you have to follow the same route they follow, because the Lemaire Channel doesn't sit in isolation. It's one link in a chain of water that starts at the bottom of South America and ends, for most ships that use it, somewhere south of Booth Island. Follow that chain from the beginning, and the reasons the risk gets taken start to make a different kind of sense. Every ship bound for this stretch of Antarctica starts the same way. At the tip of Argentina or Chile, in the port of Ushuaia, and crosses the Drake Passage, roughly 800 kilometers of open Southern Ocean between Cape Horn and the South Shetland Islands. That crossing alone takes somewhere between 1 and 2 days depending on the ship and the weather. And it is, by almost any measure, the most violent, regularly scheduled stretch of water that commercial passenger vessels sail anywhere on the planet. Waves in the Drake Passage have been reliably measured above 12 meters, occasionally well beyond that, generated by the only place on Earth where wind and current can circle the globe with no continent to interrupt them. Ships get thrown around badly enough on the Drake that seasoned crew still get sick. It has a reputation, and the reputation is earned. And then, on the far side of that crossing, something strange happens. The ship reaches the South Shetland Islands, turns south into the Bransfield Strait, or continues on toward the Lemaire Strait, and the water goes flat. Not calm exactly, not safe, but flat, sheltered by the bulk of the Antarctic Peninsula itself, which blocks the worst of the Southern Ocean's swell, the way a breakwater blocks harbor chop. This is the paradox that sits underneath everything else in this story. The open crossing that terrifies first-time passengers is, in raw statistical terms, less likely to end a voyage badly than the placid, protected, glassy calm channel that comes after it. The Lemaire Channel, when the light is right and the ice has cleared, looks like the safest place in the entire itinerary. Mirror water. Mountains doubled in the reflection. No swell at all. That is exactly the deception this whole story turns on, and it's worth sitting with for a second, because almost nothing about how the channel looks tells you anything true about what it will do. Ships heading toward Lemaire typically work down through the Lemaire Strait first, the broader channel that separates the Antarctic mainland from a scatter of islands, including Anvers and Brabant, itself named for the same expedition that later named Lemaire. From there, most itineraries pass through or near the Lemaire Channel, a second narrow passage about 26 kilometers long between Anvers Island and the Vinca and Dumer Islands, before turning toward the final approach into Lemaire itself, near a rock formation called False Cape Renard, whose twin dark spires mark the channel's northern doorway the way a gate announces itself before you've reached it. This is not a coincidence of geography. It's a deliberate routing choice repeated, ship after ship, season after season, because the alternative to using these narrow, ice-prone passages is a much longer detour around the outside of the islands, into open water that costs hours of ship time, fuel, and, for passenger vessels, a landing window that might close before they get there. The shortcut is real, so is what it costs to take it. The Lemaire Channel itself sits between the Kiev Peninsula, part of the Antarctic mainland's Graham Land, and Booth Island at a position of roughly 65 degrees, 7 minutes south, 64 degrees west, tucked into the west coast of the Antarctic Peninsula. It runs about 11 kilometers, roughly 7 miles, from its northern entrance near False Cape Renard down to its southern opening near Plano Island and the approach to Booth Island's western side. For most of that length, it holds a width somewhere in the range of 1.5 kilometers, but at its tightest point, the channel narrows to something close to 600 meters, a little over a third of a mile, walled in on both sides by cliffs and glacier faces that in places rise more than 700 meters straight out of the water. If that sounds like an oddly imprecise range for a place this well-traveled, that imprecision is honest, and it matters, because it's the first real clue to what actually makes this channel dangerous. Different surveys taken at different times, in different ice seasons, have recorded the narrowest point of Lemaire anywhere from about 600 meters to more than 1.5 kilometers. That's not sloppy measurement. It's because the channel's edges, on both sides, are made partly of glacier, and glaciers move. A face that calves a slab of ice into the water can widen a stretch of channel overnight. A winter of heavy accumulation can push that same ice front forward and choke it back down. The Lemaire Channel does not have a fixed width in the way a canal or a river gorge does. It has a width on any given day, and that number can change while a ship is still inside it. For anyone trying to picture that width without a map in front of them, it helps to reach for something closer to home. The gap between the towers of the Golden Gate Bridge, the stretch of water San Francisco Bay pours through into the Pacific, runs a little under 2 kilometers across. Lemaire's narrowest point, on the tightest surveys, comes in noticeably tighter than that. A passage a captain has to thread that's narrower than the gap the Golden Gate Bridge itself spans. Arguably the most recognized harbor entrance on the continent, except flanked not by a bridge deck and a paved city, but by 700-meter cliffs of raw glaciated rock, with no bridge, no harbor pilot boat, and no shore-based traffic control anywhere nearby to help. That single fact does more to explain the channel's reputation than almost anything else about it, and it's worth pausing on before going further, because it's the kind of detail that sounds small and is not small at all. A captain approaching Lemaire is not looking at a chart the way a captain approaches a fixed strait somewhere in normal, temperate waters. They're looking at a chart that describes a shape from the last time somebody measured it, entering a passage where the walls themselves are, in a very literal sense, alive. So who first found this gap in the rock? And why does a Belgian who never visited Antarctica have his name on it? The honest answer starts a full generation before de Gerlache's crew forced the Belgica through. And honestly, most of that story belongs to an expedition that never went south at all in the way you'd expect. A German scientific expedition working along the Antarctic Peninsula's coastline between 1873 and 1874 is generally credited as the first to have laid eyes on the opening of the channel from offshore, recording it in the way expeditions of that era did, as a notable gap in an otherwise unbroken wall of coastline. But sighting a gap in the ice from a safe distance and actually sailing a ship through it are two entirely different acts of risk, separated in this case by nearly a quarter century, and nobody closed that gap until de Gerlache's Belgica expedition arrived in the Austral summer of 1897 and 98, on a voyage that had already gone sideways in several other ways by the time it reached this particular stretch of coast. De Gerlache had set out from Antwerp in August of 1897 with a crew that was, to put it gently, an unusual mix. Funded on a shoestring carrying a young Norwegian officer named Roald Amundsen as first mate, a full generation before Amundsen would become the first person to reach the South Pole, and an American ship's doctor named Frederick Cook, whose polar career would later collapse into scandal and disputed claims. But who in 1898 was simply the expedition's physician, watching his crewmates for the first documented signs of what happens to human beings deprived of sunlight for months at a stretch. The Belgica reached Antarctic waters on January 20th of that year, later in the short polar summer than de Gerlache had planned. And over the following 3 weeks, the crew made about 20 separate landings along a channel de Gerlache himself named Belgica Strait, now generally known as the Gerlache Strait, methodically attaching the names of financial backers, scientists, and friends to islands, capes, and channels that had never been named by anyone at all, in any language. It was during this stretch of frantic naming and mapping, sometime in the early weeks of February, that the Belgica became the first ship to enter and cross the Passage de Gerlache, named for Charles Lemaire, a Belgian explorer who at that point had built his reputation not in polar ice, but in the Congo, mapping river systems and colonial territory thousands of kilometers north of any ice at all. Lemaire had no connection to Antarctica, would never see the channel that carries his name, and almost certainly learned about the honor secondhand back in Belgium, months after his friend had already sailed through it. That's not a knock on de Gerlache. It was simply how expedition-era naming worked. A debt of gratitude, a political favor, a friendship, commemorated on a map thousands of kilometers from the person it honored, whether or not that person had earned it through any act of their own in the place being named. It's worth sitting with, because it tells you something true about how much of Antarctica's map was built less on discovery than on obligation. Favors owed to the people back home who wrote the checks. What happened immediately after the Belgica cleared Lemaire is the part of this story that actually explains why the channel's reputation runs deeper than scenery. De Gerlach kept pushing south along the peninsula's coast, past the tip of the channel and beyond, crossing the Antarctic Circle on February 15th, and by the end of that month his ship was working through what the crew's own account later described in the flat language people use when they are trying not to panic in writing, as penetrating some 90 miles into the main body of the sea ice before finding themselves, in their word, firmly beset. On March 3, 1898, the Belgica stopped moving, locked into pack ice that would not release her for 13 months. It became the first ship in history to overwinter in Antarctic waters, not by plan, but because de Gerlach had pushed his timeline and his ship past the point where retreat was still possible. Scurvy spread through the crew for lack of fresh food. At least one crew member, a sailor named Karl Vinke, died during the ordeal, washed overboard in a squall before the ship was even beset. And by the depths of the polar night, months into the entrapment, the ship's own log and the accounts of Cook and Amundsen describe crew members slipping into what reads, even at a century's distance, like genuine psychological collapse, men who stopped speaking, stopped eating, or wandered the ice in confusion. The ship was finally freed on March 14, 1899, more than a year after it had first sailed the channel that would later carry Lemaire's name. Here is the connection that matters, and it holds up as a sequence of real decisions made by the same crew within weeks of each other. The same instinct that let de Gerlach thread his ship through a channel barely wider than his vessel's own length 3 times over, without knowing what lay past the next bend, is the instinct that then carried him 90 miles into pack ice he could not escape. Lemaire didn't cause what happened to the Belgica afterward, but it was the same appetite for risk, the same willingness to trade caution for progress when the season was running out, that took the ship through both. That's the pattern this whole story keeps returning to, in one form or another, for the next 125 years. Captains who look at a narrow, ice-choked gap in the rock, weigh what they know against what they don't, and go anyway. 5 years after the Belgica limped home, a French physician turned polar explorer named Jean-Baptiste Charcot brought his own ship, a converted fishing vessel he renamed Francais, back to this same stretch of coast, and his relationship with the Lemaire Channel says almost as much about the place as de Gerlach's first crossing did. Charcot's expedition ran from 1903 to 1905, and instead of rushing south the way de Gerlach had, his crew wintered deliberately at a harbor on the north coast of Booth Island that they named Port Charcot, using the season to build a base, take soundings, and study the coastline with something closer to patience than the Belgica had ever managed. From there, Charcot pushed the Francais south through the Lemaire Channel, aiming for the Biscoe Islands further down the coast. He didn't make it. Thick sea ice, combined with recurring engine trouble on a ship that had never been built for this kind of work, forced the Francais to retreat back north through the same narrows it had just come down. It's a small failure in the scheme of Charcot's career, barely a footnote in most accounts of the expedition, but it's an early, clean example of something that would repeat itself for the next century. Ships reaching Lemaire's southern approaches with a destination beyond it, and ice deciding on its own schedule whether that destination was reachable that day. Charcot came back. In 1908, he returned to Antarctica with a purpose-built polar vessel, a 3-masted bark named Pourquoi Pas, fitted with an auxiliary motor, 3 onboard laboratories, and enough capability that this second expedition, running from 1908 to 1910, would go on to chart Alexander Island and discover new territory that still carries Charcot's name today. This time his ship wintered at Petermann Island, a small outcrop sitting just south of Booth Island, meaning that to reach their winter base, re-provision it, and eventually leave it, The Pourquoi Pas and her crew had to treat the Lemaire Channel not as a detour, but as their only practical front door. That's worth sitting with because it marks the moment this channel stopped being an obstacle explorers occasionally attempted and became infrastructure, a route a working expedition depended on, the same way a modern supply chain depends on a bridge or a tunnel. Once a ship's survival for an entire winter runs through a passage, that passage stops being optional scenery and starts being a decision made under duress, again and again, for as long as the expedition needs to use it. If you sail through the Lemaire Channel today, on almost any expedition ship working the Antarctic Peninsula in the austral summer, the geography that made Charcot's crew nervous is still exactly what you're looking at, unchanged in its bones even as its edges shift with the ice. The northern entrance is marked by False Cape Renard, a pair of dark, near-vertical rock spires that rise straight out of the water like a gate announcing itself before you've actually reached it. Named False because early sailors mistook it, from a distance, for the real Cape Renard further down the coast. Behind those spires, the channel's eastern wall climbs through a run of peaks that includes Una Peaks and Mount Cluse, glaciated summits that in places drop more than 700 meters almost directly into the water with barely a beach or a shoreline shelf to interrupt the fall. There is nowhere, for most of the channel's length, for a ship in trouble to simply pull over. The walls don't allow it. You are either moving forward, moving back, or you are stopped. And stopped is not a stable option in water this narrow. This is the geography that earned the channel its most repeated nickname among the people who actually travel it for a living. Expedition guides and photographers who started calling it Kodak Gap, decades before anyone worried much about the word iconic. On a still day, with the light low and gold the way it gets during the Antarctic summer's long evenings, the water inside Lemaire turns into something close to a mirror, doubling the cliffs and the glaciers and whatever icebergs happen to be drifting past, and it is, by wide consensus among people who have seen most of what this planet's coastlines have to offer, one of the most striking pieces of ocean scenery anywhere on Earth. That reputation is not exaggerated for effect. It's the actual, specific, repeatedly verified reason cruise operators build entire itineraries around a chance at getting through. Photographs from inside the channel circulate constantly in Antarctic tourism marketing precisely because they are not staged, not enhanced beyond the ordinary editing any photograph gets. Just an accurate record of what several hundred meters of glacier-walled water looks like when the wind happens to stop. And that stillness is the second half of the deception this story keeps circling back to. The same protection from open ocean swell that makes Lemaire look safer than the Drake Passage crossing that got everyone here also means the channel behaves less like open water and more like a trap for anything that drifts into it, including ice. Icebergs calved from the glacier fronts along both walls, along with smaller fragments and pack ice pushed in from the Lemaire Strait to the north, tend to circulate inside Lemaire instead of passing through it, caught by currents that swirl through the Narrows and the wider basin just south of it, near Booth Island and Plano Island, in patterns that people who work these waters have taken to calling, only half-joking, the iceberg garden. Or, when the season has been especially heavy, the iceberg graveyard. Ice that enters rarely leaves quickly, it circles. It grounds itself on shallow patches of seafloor and stays there for weeks, reshaped slowly by melt and current, until it either breaks apart or finally drifts free. On a bad ice day, a channel a captain expected to be open can be found, without warning, packed almost solid with bergs that entered days or weeks earlier and simply never left. Here is where the honest uncertainty in this story actually lives, and it's worth naming directly rather than gesturing past it. Nobody has published a complete, current-by-current model of exactly how water moves through the Lemaire Channel and the basin south of it, the kind of fine-grained oceanographic mapping that exists for, say, a major shipping strait in temperate waters with a century of commercial traffic and permanent survey stations. What exists instead is pattern recognition built up over decades by expedition captains, guides, and the occasional research crews passing through, an accumulated practical sense of where ice tends to gather and when, without a fully mapped mechanism underneath it. Ask a veteran Antarctic expedition captain why the ice piles up worse in one part of the channel than another in a given week, and you'll generally get a confident, experience-based answer. Ask for the published bathymetric and current data that would let you predict it 6 months in advance from a desk in another hemisphere, and that data, in the kind of resolution that would actually satisfy the question, mostly doesn't exist. That's not a failure of anyone's research. It's a reflection of how much of the Antarctic Peninsula's coastal water remains, even now more thoroughly known by the people who navigate it daily than by any single chart. Let's get specific about what's actually floating in that water, because ice is doing a lot of work as a word here, and treating it as one uniform hazard misses most of what makes it dangerous. Sailors and ice pilots working polar waters sort floating ice into rough categories by size and behavior, and 3 of them matter most inside a channel like Lemaire. There's brash ice, the wreckage of larger pieces broken down by wave action and collision into fragments generally no wider than 2 meters. The stuff that looks, from a ship's deck, almost like a field of floating gravel, and which a reasonably powered, ice-strengthened hull can usually push through at reduced speed without much drama. Then there's the bergy bit, a chunk broken from a larger iceberg or glacier front, standing somewhere between 1 and 5 meters above the waterline, and covering an area that can run to a few hundred square meters, big enough to do real damage to a hull on contact, but generally large and visible enough that a competent watch will spot it in decent light. And then there's the growler, and the growler is the one that actually keeps ice pilots up at night. A growler is old ice, dense, often years old, compressed by its own weight until it's lost most of its air pockets, which means it rides low, sometimes barely a meter above the water, sometimes almost flush with the surface, greenish or nearly black, instead of the bright white of fresh berg ice, and roughly the size of a small car or a delivery truck. It is dense enough to hole a hull, low enough to be nearly invisible against wave chop even in daylight, and because it sits so low and carries so little surface area above water, it is notoriously difficult for marine radar to pick up reliably, especially in any kind of sea state. A growler can sit directly in a ship's path, at night, in exactly the kind of narrow channel where there's no room to alter course by more than a few degrees, and the first indication of its presence can be the sound of it against the hull. This is not a hypothetical risk dreamed up for dramatic effect. It's a documented, ongoing operational concern for the people who actually run ships in these waters, serious enough that some of the newest polar-class vessels built for Antarctic tourism, ships like the Commandant Charcot and the Sir David Attenborough, mount their under-ice sonar systems on retractable hoists instead of fixed-through hull installations. Specifically so, a strike against a growler or a chunk of brash ice damages a replaceable sensor rather than punching a hole below the waterline. None of that technology solves the problem so much as it manages it. A hoisted sonar system still depends on someone reading its output correctly, in real time, while a channel wall sits less than a few hundred meters off each rail and there is no room to simply stop and think, which is really the core of what makes Lemaire different from open deep water, even when the total volume of ice in it is objectively less than what a ship might cross further offshore. In open water, ice is a hazard you can steer widely around. In a channel 600 meters across at its narrowest, with rock and glacier on both sides, a captain's steering options collapse to a genuinely narrow band, sometimes down to a matter of a few dozen meters of usable water. And every piece of ice inside that band, from a piece of harmless brash to a nearly invisible growler, has to be accounted for using instruments and eyesight that both have known well-documented limits. Ice isn't the only thing the channel walls do to a ship. It's worth understanding what katabatic wind actually is, because the word gets thrown around loosely in Antarctic content, and the mechanism behind it is specific and worth explaining properly. Cold, dense air sits over the Antarctic ice sheet at altitude, and because cold air is heavier than warm air, it doesn't need a storm system to start moving. It just needs gravity and a slope to run down. That drainage of cold air off the polar plateau and down toward the coast is what generates a katabatic wind, and normally, spread across open terrain, it arrives as a strong but manageable breeze. The problem starts when that draining air gets funneled through a constriction, the same way water speeds up when a wide river narrows into a gorge. A channel like Lemaire, walled by cliffs and glaciers on both sides and running for 11 kilometers in a fairly consistent direction, is close to an ideal funnel for exactly this effect. Recorded katabatic events along the Antarctic Peninsula have reached sustained speeds in the range of 80 knots, something in the neighborhood of 92 miles an hour, arriving with little warning on days that, 20 minutes earlier, looked like the calmest, most mirror-still water anyone on board had seen all trip. That combination, glass-calm water turning to whitecap chaos inside the span of a few minutes, is one of the more specifically Antarctic dangers this channel produces. And it hits hardest not against the main ship but against the small, inflatable Zodiac boats that expedition companies use to ferry passengers close to shorelines, glacier fronts, and wildlife colonies. A Zodiac caught in open water near a glacier face when a katabatic gust arrives, or worse, near the face, at the moment it calves a slab of ice into the sea, is dealing with two compounding hazards at once: a sudden, violent wind with no buildup to warn of it, and a wave generated by tons of ice hitting water within a boat length or two of a 9-meter inflatable carrying a dozen passengers. Expedition guides train specifically to read glacier faces for the visual cues that precede a calving event. Listen for the characteristic cracking sound that often, though not always, precedes a major break, and keep a working distance from active ice fronts. None of that eliminates the risk. It manages it the same way the hoisted sonar manages the growler problem, by trading elimination for competent, practiced judgment applied continuously, dozens of times a day, by people whose entire job is noticing the thing before it happens. Underneath all of that, ice, wind, the narrowness of the walls, sits a more basic problem that applies to the whole region, and not just to Lemaire specifically, and it deserves to be named plainly, not tucked quietly into the rest. Large stretches of Antarctic coastal water remain, by any honest standard, poorly surveyed. Hydrographic agencies around the world have been working for decades to close the gap, but the Southern Ocean's coastline is enormous. The weather window for safe survey work is short, and the funding for this kind of unglamorous, expensive marine science has never remotely kept pace with the scale of what's left to measure. In the spring of 2026, a research team working in the Weddell Sea, on the opposite side of the peninsula from Lemaire, had to divert their vessel into the lee of Joinville Island to shelter from rough weather, and in doing so found land that, on their navigational charts, existed only as a vaguely marked hazard zone instead of an actual mapped island. The chart hadn't been wrong exactly. It had simply never had enough survey data to draw the coastline with confidence, so the cartography defaulted to a caution flag instead of a shape. And an entire island had, in effect, gone missing from the map by omission, rather than by error. That story isn't about Lemaire Channel itself, and it would be dishonest to pretend it happened there. But it's the right context for understanding what well-traveled actually means in these waters, because it doesn't mean fully charted the way it would almost anywhere else ships regularly operate. The Lemaire Channel's main navigable water has been transited enough times by enough expedition and cruise vessels that its principal deep water track is about as well known as anywhere in this part of Antarctica gets. But the margins, the shallow patches near the walls, the exact seafloor contour beneath the spots where icebergs like to ground themselves, the fine-grained detail that would let a ship's electronic charting system flag a hazard with the same confidence it would in, say, the English Channel or Puget Sound. That level of detail simply isn't there yet and won't be for years, maybe decades. Captains navigating Lemaire are, in a real and specific sense, relying more heavily on accumulated personal and institutional experience, passed down through briefings, logs, and word of mouth between expedition companies, than on the kind of exhaustively surveyed chart data that sailors elsewhere take for granted. This is the precise shape of the uncertainty at the center of this story, and it's worth stating without either exaggerating it or explaining it away. It is not true that the Lemaire Channel is some unmapped mystery zone where ships venture blind. The main channel is known, transited constantly, generally safe under competent, cautious command. It is also not true that everything about the channel's behavior, its currents, its exact ice patterns, its underwater margins, is fully understood and predictable. The honest position sits in between those two claims. Enough is known to make regular transit reasonable, not enough is known to make it routine in the way a ferry crossing is routine, and that gap is exactly where the risk lives, and exactly why every transit still depends on a human being making a judgment call instead of a machine executing a known safe procedure. So how does a real captain actually make that call, standing on the bridge with a channel ahead that might be clear or might be packed solid, and no way to know for certain until the ship is already committed? The answer starts well before the ship gets anywhere near false Cape Renard. Modern expedition operators working the Antarctic Peninsula share ice reports constantly, radio traffic between vessels already in the area, satellite imagery updated as conditions allow, and word passed ship to ship about what the last transit actually looked like, sometimes only hours old. A captain approaching Lemaire today typically already has a reasonably current picture of ice conditions before committing to the approach, built from other ships' recent experience instead of from any single authoritative source. It's an informal, cooperative intelligence network, built out of necessity because no formal one exists at the resolution this kind of decision actually requires. Even with a decent picture of conditions, the decision doesn't end at the northern entrance. Ships slow to a crawl approaching false Cape Renard, and an officer on the bridge, sometimes the captain personally, sometimes a specialist ice pilot carried specifically for this kind of work, makes a visual assessment of what's ahead, how much ice is visible, how it's distributed, whether it looks like it's actively moving with current or wind, whether there's a clear lane through it wide enough for the ship's beam with margin to spare. If the channel looks passable, the ship proceeds, generally at reduced speed, with extra lookouts posted and the bridge crew in close, continuous communication. If it looks choked, if the ice appears to run wall to wall with no usable lane, the accepted practice, and this is about as close to a universal rule as this kind of unregulated, judgment-heavy navigation gets, is that the captain turns the ship around rather than commit to forcing a passage that might close in further behind the ship before it clears the far end. Reversing course in open water outside the narrows costs time, sometimes hours, sometimes a full missed excursion for passengers who'd been promised a look at Kodak Gap. It is, without much argument among people who actually do this job, still the correct decision every time the alternative is uncertain. When Lemaire is closed, ships don't just give up on the day's plan, because the whole point of routing through this stretch of coast in the first place was reaching the scenery and the landing sites clustered around Booth Island, Plano Island, and the Argentine research station further south. There are two accepted workarounds, and both of them say something honest about how thin the margin for choice actually is down here. The first is to route around the exterior of Booth Island entirely, adding hours of open, less protected water to reach the same southern destinations by a longer, less scenic path. The second is the Lemaire Channel, a second narrow passage roughly 26 kilometers long between Anvers Island and the Vinca and Daumer Islands, which offers much of the same dramatic glacier-walled scenery as Lemaire and functions as its most common substitute when the ice makes the shorter route impassable. The catch, and this is worth being honest about instead of presenting Neumayer as some safe backup, is that Neumayer is itself a narrow channel prone to exactly the same kind of ice blockage, sometimes on the same days, for many of the same reasons. It's also flanked by glacier-fed walls, also subject to the same currents pushing ice down from the Lemaire Strait. On the worst ice days, both routes close at once, and a ship's only remaining option is the long way around, adding real hours to a schedule that for a passenger cruise has real, contractual limits on how long the day can run. There's a regulatory layer sitting underneath all of this decision-making that's worth understanding because it explains why this remains a managed risk instead of a genuinely reckless one, despite everything that's been said so far. Since 2017, ships operating in Antarctic waters have fallen under the International Maritime Organization's Polar Code, a set of binding requirements covering hull strength, crew training, and equipment specifically intended for ice-affected voyages, which means a vessel legally operating in the Lemaire Channel today is required to meet a baseline of ice readiness that simply didn't exist as formal law a generation earlier. On top of that, the industry's own voluntary body, the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators, maintains a widely observed guideline that vessels carrying more than 500 passengers do not make landings in Antarctica at all, which as a side effect keeps the ships attempting narrow technical passages like Lemaire, generally on the smaller, more maneuverable end of the size spectrum, vessels built with the engine responsiveness and the shallow enough draft to actually work a channel this tight. None of this makes the transit safe in the sense of guaranteed. It makes it a managed risk, taken by trained crews, in appropriately built ships, following an accumulated body of practical rules that exists precisely because the alternative, doing this without any of that structure, has already produced enough close calls across the decades to make the structure necessary. All of that structure exists because the region around Lemaire has already demonstrated, more than once, exactly what happens when a ship's margin runs out, even under professional command, even with none of the recklessness that makes disaster stories easy to tell. It's important to be precise here about which incidents happened where, because it would be easy and dishonest to borrow drama from a nearby wreck and imply it happened inside the channel this story is actually about. It didn't. But these incidents happened close enough in similar water under similar conditions that they're the right comparison for understanding what this whole stretch of coast is capable of doing to a ship, even one that's done everything by the book. On January 28, 1989, the Argentine supply and tourist vessel Bahia Paraíso ran aground while leaving Arthur Harbor near the United States Palmer Station on Anvers Island, a little more than a day's sailing north of Lemaire along the same general stretch of peninsula coastline. The grounding tore a roughly 10-meter gash in the hull, and the ship spilled most of its cargo of diesel, jet fuel, gasoline, and assorted lubricants directly into the harbor, one of the worst environmental disasters Antarctic waters have ever recorded, with damage to local wildlife and seafloor habitat that outlasted the ship itself by decades. All 81 tourists and 234 crew members survived, brought ashore safely to the nearby research station, and it's worth saying plainly that nobody died in that incident. But it's also worth being honest about what it demonstrates, that a competent, licensed crew in a ship built for these waters, following a route they'd run before, can still make the kind of navigational miscalculation that turns a routine harbor departure into an environmental catastrophe, in water that on the chart looked entirely survivable. Almost exactly 20 years later, on December 4, 2008, the expedition ship MV Ushuaia ran aground near the entrance to Wilhelmina Bay, at a position not far south of the Lemaire Strait that every ship bound for Lemaire has to pass through first, striking bottom in water its own charts hadn't flagged as hazardous? No one died in that grounding either. And the response is honestly one of the better stories the region has to tell about itself. Nearby vessels, including the Antarctic Dream and the National Geographic Explorer, diverted immediately to assist, and passengers were transferred off safely before the situation could worsen. But the Ushuaia was a member vessel of the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators, operating under the same voluntary safety framework every serious operator in these waters follows, with an experienced crew running an established route. It still ran aground, in water it had sailed before, because the chart underneath it didn't tell the whole story of what was actually there. Neither of those ships was in the Lemaire Channel when it happened, and it would be a cheap trick to pretend otherwise. What they demonstrate instead, honestly, is the operating environment the channel sits inside. A stretch of Antarctic Peninsula coastline where professional crews, IAATO-compliant vessels, and charts that are the best currently available still occasionally collide with a gap between what's known and what's actually there. Lemaire doesn't exist in some safer bubble separate from that pattern. It exists as one of the tightest, most consequence-heavy expressions of exactly the same underlying condition, a place where the margin for the kind of error that produced Bahia Paraíso or the Ushuaia grounding is smaller, because the water is narrower, the walls are closer, and there is less room, in every direction, to absorb a mistake once it's already been made. So why do it? Why does a captain, aware of everything just described, aware of growlers that don't show on radar, of glacier walls that redraw the channel's width without warning, of an underlying chart that admits, if you read it honestly, to gaps in what it actually knows, still choose to point the bow toward false Cape Renard, instead of taking the long way around every single time? The answer has little to do with recklessness, and not much more to do with ignorance. What's actually driving it is a set of ordinary calculable reasons that, added together, make the risk look different from the bridge than it does from a description of the risk alone. Start with the plainest one: distance and time. Routing around the exterior of Booth Island to reach the same landing sites and the same southern approaches that Lemaire opens directly onto adds real hours to a ship's schedule, hours that, on a passenger cruise running a tight itinerary with a fixed number of days in Antarctic waters, before the return crossing of the Drake Passage has to begin, are not free. Fuel costs money and, more scarce than money in this particular business, daylight and weather windows are finite. An Antarctic expedition season runs roughly 5 months, from November through March, and within that window, the days a ship has calm enough water and clear enough visibility to safely attempt Lemaire at all are a fraction of the total. Skip the shortcut every time in favor of the safer long way around, and a ship simply cannot deliver the number of landing sites and the quality of experience that modern Antarctic tourism has built its entire business model around. The shortcut isn't a convenience. For the industry as it currently operates, it's closer to a structural necessity. Then there's the harder thing to put a number on, which is that the scenery genuinely is the product. Antarctic tourism sells an experience that is, at its core, about witnessing a landscape most passengers will see exactly once in their lives. And Lemaire Channel, on a clear, calm day, delivers a version of that landscape concentrated and framed in a way almost nowhere else on the itinerary matches: mirror water. Glacier walls close enough to feel, not just see. The specific, repeated, honestly earned nickname, Kodak Gap, exists because passengers and professional photographers alike, independently, over decades, kept reaching for their cameras at the same stretch of water for the same reason. A cruise operator who consistently routes around Lemaire in favor of caution when the ice would have allowed a safe transit is not just adding hours to a schedule, they're removing the single scene most likely to end up as the photograph a passenger shows people for the rest of their life. That's not a trivial commercial consideration. In an industry built entirely on word-of-mouth reviews and repeat referrals from people who paid a significant amount of money for exactly this kind of memory, it's close to the whole business. There's also something less transactional going on, something closer to what Charcot must have felt pushing the Francais south a second time after ice turned him back the first. And it's worth naming honestly, rather than dressing it up. Antarctic expedition crews, guides, and captains are, disproportionately, people who chose this career specifically because they wanted to be somewhere few people go, doing something that still requires real judgment instead of automated procedure, threading a genuinely narrow, genuinely consequential passage correctly, using experience and a trained eye instead of an app or an algorithm, is not incidental to why a lot of these people do this job. It's close to the point of it. That doesn't mean anyone is reckless about it. The entire structure of ICE reports, IA80 guidelines, and Polar Code compliance described earlier exists specifically to keep that instinct channeled inside a framework of caution rather than let loose without one. But pretending the human satisfaction of doing something difficult and doing it well has nothing to do with why this route keeps getting chosen, would be its own kind of dishonesty. And underneath both of those reasons sits the paradox that opened this whole story. The water inside Lemaire, on the days it's passable at all, is frequently the calmest, most protected stretch of the entire voyage. A captain weighing the decision isn't just weighing risky channel versus safe open water. They're often weighing the one stretch of today's route where the ship will actually stop rolling, where seasick passengers will finally get a break, where the photography will actually be usable, against several more hours of the kind of exposed swell everyone just spent 2 days crossing the Drake Passage to get away from. Framed that way, from inside an actual command decision instead of from a list of hazards on a page, the appeal of Lemaire on a clear day stops being a mystery and becomes quite simply the easiest, most obviously correct call a captain will make that week. The difficulty and the actual danger only shows up on the days the ice or the wind or the light don't cooperate, and the same channel that offered the calmest water on the map becomes, within the length of a single watch, the tightest and least forgiving stretch of the entire voyage. It's worth picturing what that decision actually looks and feels like from the bridge, not as a single documented incident with a name and a date attached, because most of these moments are never written up or published anywhere, just logged, radioed to the next ship, and forgotten within days. But the pattern itself is well and repeatedly attested by the people who live it, described consistently enough, season after season, by expedition captains and guides, that reconstructing a representative version of it is the most honest way to make the decision legible. It's early morning, the light already high, because the sun barely sets this far south in midsummer, and the ship has been holding position for 20 minutes at the northern approach to the channel, engines idling, while the officer of the watch and the ship's ice pilot study the water ahead through binoculars from the bridge wing. The previous day's radio traffic said the channel had been running about 70% clear, workable but tight. Overnight, wind out of the southwest pushed a field of loose pack ice up from the Lemaire Strait, and what's visible now, stretching between the base of False Cape Renard and the glacier front on the Booth Island side, is closer to 85 or 90% coverage, broken ice, and a scatter of larger bergs sitting in a channel that from this distance looks less like open water with ice in it and more like ice with water in it. Somewhere in that field, invisible from here and probably invisible from much closer too, there are almost certainly growlers, riding low, dark, exactly the kind of hazard the radar struggles to separate from wave clutter. The pilot doesn't rush the call. They study the movement of the ice field for several more minutes, watching whether the loose pack is drifting with any discernible pattern, whether there's a lane, even a narrow one, holding open along the eastern wall, where the current tends to run faster and keep ice moving instead of settling. If a lane exists and holds for the length of time it will take the ship to transit it at a safe, reduced speed, roughly 90 minutes to 2 hours depending on conditions, the recommendation is to proceed carefully, with extra lookouts posted on both bridge wings and the ship's speed cut low enough that a late course correction around a spotted hazard is still physically possible without a hard turn in water too narrow to allow one. If no lane holds, if the ice looks like it's consolidating rather than moving, the call is just as practiced and just as fast once it's made. Stand off, radio the next ship in the area with an updated report, and turn south around the exterior of Booth Island instead, adding perhaps 3 to 4 hours to the day's schedule and quietly rewriting the shore excursions planned for that afternoon. Passengers standing on deck during this whole process usually have no idea how much deliberation just happened in the space of 20 or 30 minutes. What they see if the ship goes ahead is simply the bow easing forward into a channel that looks, from a lounge chair on the observation deck, entirely serene, walled in dramatic cliffs, dotted with ice that reads as scenery instead of hazard. What they don't see is the specific trained judgment that decided just minutes earlier that this particular ice field, at this particular density, in this particular light, with this particular wind forecast for the next 2 hours, was one the ship could reasonably cross. That gap between what the passengers experience as beauty and what the bridge crew experiences as a continuously monitored risk assessment is close to the emotional center of what makes this channel what it is. It is genuinely among the most beautiful stretches of coastline these passengers will see in their entire lives. It is also, at the exact same moment, being actively managed by people whose entire attention is fixed on the difference between the ice that's merely photogenic and the ice that could open a ship's hull. Once a ship actually clears the southern end of the channel, past the last of the glacier walls, and out into the more open water near Plano Island, it's worth following the route the rest of the way, because the destinations on the far side are the whole reason any of this risk gets taken in the first place, and they don't get talked about nearly as often as the channel that guards them. This is the part of the map that Charcot's crew were trying to reach in 1903, and that they finally secured for themselves 5 years later. Plano Island itself sits close enough to the southern mouth of Lemaire that it's often folded into the same excursion, and it has its own nickname among expedition guides, the Iceberg Graveyard. The same swirling current basin mentioned earlier, where bergs calved from glaciers up and down the coast tend to accumulate, ground themselves in shallow water, and sit for weeks or months, slowly reshaping under sun, and melt into the kind of sculptural, wind-carved forms that fill Antarctic photography books. A short distance further south sits Petermann Island, small, low, and easy to miss on a map next to the dramatic scale of everything around it. But it's here that Charcot's Pourquoi Pas crew spent their 1908 to 1910 winter, and physical traces of that stay still mark the island today. A cairn built at the expedition's highest lookout point, chains once used to secure the ship, and the letters PP for Pourquoi Pas, carved directly into the rock, all formally protected now as a designated historic site under the Antarctic Treaty. Petermann is also, in the present, among the more dependable spots on the entire peninsula to find a breeding colony of Adelie penguins holding on this far north of their usual range, alongside Gentoo penguins that have, over the past several decades, been steadily expanding their own breeding range further south as the regional climate has warmed. A slow-motion population shift that researchers monitoring the site have documented year over year. Further south again, past the Yalur Islands and into the Panola Strait, ships bound for the more remote stretches of this itinerary reach the Argentine Islands, home to Vernadsky Station, a research base with a genuinely improbable claim to fame. Under its previous identity as the British-run Faraday Station, it was one of the 2 Antarctic outposts. alongside Halley Research Station further along the coast, whose long-running ozone measurements fed the landmark 1985 paper that first reported the seasonal thinning of atmospheric ozone above Antarctica, a discovery that reshaped global environmental policy and eventually produced the Montreal Protocol, widely regarded as the most successful international environmental treaty ever ratified. Halley generally gets the larger share of credit since its data most directly triggered the finding. But Faraday's decades of continuous readings, stretching back to 1947, gave the discovery a second, independent line of evidence, and that unbroken record is part of why Vernadsky today holds the distinction of the longest continually staffed research station anywhere in Antarctica. Since Ukraine took over the base in a 1996 handover, it has kept running that same atmospheric research and has also become locally famous. In the specific and slightly absurd way small polar outposts sometimes become famous for operating what's widely described as the southernmost bar in the world, staffed by the station's own researchers, a detail that tends to surprise passengers more than almost anything else on the entire voyage. Petermann carries a second, more somber marker too, a cross and cairn at the island's highest point, placed in memory of 3 British Antarctic Survey personnel who died in 1982, attempting exactly the kind of crossing this whole story has been describing from the deck of a ship, except on foot. The 3 men had set out across what they believed was stable sea ice, trying to travel from Petermann to the research station at Faraday, the same base now known as Vernadsky, and the ice gave way beneath them before they completed the crossing. It's a sobering, necessary reminder that the danger this story keeps circling isn't confined to the deck of a large vessel with redundant engines and a trained ice pilot on the bridge. The same unpredictable, shifting relationship between solid-looking ice and the water underneath it that threatens a ship's hull in the Lemaire Channel has, at least once, proven fatal to people trying to cross that same boundary on foot, with nothing beneath them but their own judgment about how much weight the ice could actually hold. None of these destinations are reachable on a normal Antarctic Peninsula itinerary, without either passing through Lemaire or accepting the longer detour around it. That's the geography this whole story has been tracing from the start. And it's worth stating plainly now that the traverse has actually reached the places the shortcut exists to serve. The risk taken at the Narrows was never abstract, and it was never taken for the channel's own sake. It was taken because Petermann's penguin colonies, Vernadsky's ozone hole legacy, and its improbable bar, and the whole cluster of landing sites around the Argentine islands sit on the far side of a gap in the rock that only a fraction of each 5-month season allows a ship to cross safely. Every hour saved by threading Lemaire instead of going around is an hour that ends up spent, instead, actually standing on one of these islands. And that's the trade a captain is really making every time they choose the Narrows over the long way. There's a version of this story that could be told purely through hazard and consequence, ice density and wind speed, and the tonnage of a hull against the tonnage of a berg. And that version wouldn't be wrong, but it would miss most of what actually happens to a ship and its passengers during the 2 hours it takes to clear the channel, because for most of that time, the dominant experience on deck isn't fear at all. It's quiet. Humpback whales feed heavily in the waters around the Lemaire Strait and the approaches to Lemaire through the Austral summer. Drawn by dense concentrations of Antarctic krill, and it's common enough for a ship easing through the Narrows to have to hold position briefly while a pod works the water nearby, unbothered by the engine noise, surfacing and diving in slow, unhurried rhythm a few dozen meters off the rail. Craybeater seals haul out on the flatter pans of drifting ice, sometimes in small groups, sleeping through the ship's passage entirely, and leopard seals, solitary and considerably more alert, are occasionally spotted patrolling the edges of the ice for exactly the kind of opportunity the channel's crowded ice field provides. Penguins forced to swim between floes instead of staying dry. Gentoo penguins, recognizable even from deck level by the white patch above each eye, porpoise alongside the ship in loose groups, breaking the surface in quick arcs that look, at a glance, almost playful, though the behavior is really about minimizing the time spent exposed to exactly the leopard seals working the same water. None of this contradicts anything said earlier about growlers and radar and katabatic wind. It sits alongside it in the same 20 minutes, because that's genuinely what transiting Lemaire on a good day is actually like. A bridge crew running a continuous, disciplined hazard assessment, and, one deck below them, passengers leaning against the rail in silence, watching a whale surface twice and vanish, feeling, correctly, that they are somewhere almost nobody else on Earth has stood. Guides on these ships have described consistently enough across different companies and different years that it reads as a genuine pattern rather than a marketing line, a specific kind of hush that settles over a full ship's deck of otherwise talkative passengers somewhere in the middle of the channel, conversations trailing off unprompted, phones lowered after the first few photographs, people just watching. It isn't manufactured. Scale does that to people reliably enough that guides have learned to expect it and stop trying to narrate over it. That quiet is worth holding on to for a second, because it's the honest, emotional core underneath everything mechanical this story has described so far. The same conditions that make Lemaire dangerous, the stillness, the enclosure, the walls close enough to feel instead of merely see, are exactly the conditions that make it move people the way it does. You cannot pull the risk out of the beauty here and still be describing the same channel. They are produced by the same geography, at the same time, and every ship that makes it through carries passengers who experienced both at once, usually without ever being told, in so many words, how close the second half of that experience came to, depending on the first. It's worth stepping back at this point and putting some real numbers behind how often this decision, the one just described from the bridge, actually gets made, because it isn't a rare event anymore. Antarctic tourism has grown from a niche pursuit for a few thousand people a year into an industry that, according to the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators, carried a little over 122,000 visitors to the continent in the 2023 to 2024 season, and roughly 118,000 the following season. Numbers that have stayed solidly above the 100,000 mark for several years, running now after crossing it for the first time only recently. Something close to 98% of all Antarctic tourism happens specifically on the peninsula, the exact stretch of coastline this whole story has been tracing, which means that on any given clear morning during the 5-month season, there is a real, non-trivial chance that more than one ship is independently making the same approach and assess decision at the northern mouth of Lemaire within hours of each other. This is no longer a once-a-decade act of daring performed by a handful of dedicated explorers. It's routine industrial navigation, repeated dozens of times a week across a season, by an industry whose growth curve, at least up to the numbers currently available, keeps pointing up. That scale is worth holding against the comparison this story opened with. The claim that Lemaire is the most dangerous maritime shortcut into Antarctic waters, because scale is part of what that claim actually rests on. There are other narrow, ice-affected passages around the world that carry heavier historical reputations for raw destructiveness. The Strait of Magellan at the tip of South America chief among them, a route so consistently violent to sailing ships in the age before steam power that mariners for centuries considered rounding Cape Horn through open ocean the safer alternative, despite the horrors that route carried in its own right. But the Strait of Magellan is a different kind of hazard, wide in places, driven mainly by ferocious and unpredictable wind instead of ice. And it sits well outside Antarctic water entirely, a temperate latitude passage between two oceans. Lemaire's claim to its own specific superlative doesn't rest on being more violent than every dangerous strait on Earth. It rests on something narrower. Among the routes ships actually use, routinely, on a fixed and repeated schedule, specifically to enter the ice-affected waters of Antarctica, none combines Lemaire's narrowness, its unpredictable and radar-resistant ice hazard, its funnel-driven wind risk, and its incomplete underlying chart data into a single 11-kilometer stretch that 100,000-plus visitors a year are now counting on crossing safely, twice, on both the way in and the way back out. That's the honest shape of the superlative this story set out to test at the beginning. Not deadliest by body count, not most violent by wave height, most dangerous specifically as a working shortcut, a route chosen again and again by an industry that has scaled dramatically in the last decade into water where several distinct, independently verified hazards stack directly on top of each other in a passage too narrow to offer much room to dodge any one of them individually. The comparison holds. It just holds for a narrower, more specific reason than the word dangerous tends to carry on its own. There's one more layer to the uncertainty in this story, and it's a different kind than the ones already covered, because it operates on a completely different timescale. Everything said so far about the channel's shifting width, glacier fronts advancing and retreating enough between surveys to explain why one chart says 600 meters at the narrowest and another says closer to 1.5 kilometers, has been described as a short-term, week-to-week, and season-to-season phenomenon. Layered underneath that short-term variability is a long-term trend that is, by contrast, about as well documented and scientifically settled as anything in this story gets. The Antarctic Peninsula is one of the fastest warming regions on the entire planet, with temperatures across the region having risen by more than 3 degrees Celsius over the past 50 years. A pace researchers studying the area have put it somewhere around 5 times the global average rate of warming. Of the glaciers along the peninsula's western coastline, traces the same coastline that includes both walls of the Lemaire Channel, something in the range of 87 to 90% have been retreating over that same 50-year period, and the pace of that retreat has itself been accelerating since roughly the late 1990s, rather than holding steady. Nobody has published a study isolating exactly how much narrower or wider the Lemaire Channel itself has become as a direct result of that regional trend, and it would be overstating the evidence to claim a specific number here that doesn't exist in the record. What can honestly be said is that the channel sits inside a region where the glaciers forming its walls belong to a population that is overwhelmingly retreating, and where that retreat has been speeding up instead of slowing down for a quarter century. It's a reasonable, well-supported inference that the channel's average width, measured over multi-decade timescales, is trending in the direction of that broader retreat, even though the specific short-term, ship-by-ship variability described earlier, the day-to-day advances and calving events that make one week's chart different from the next, is governed by a separate and much less predictable set of local processes that no one has fully modeled. 2 different kinds of uncertainty sitting on top of each other at 2 very different timescales, one of them backed by decades of consistent regional temperature and glacier data, the other still resistant to anything more precise than the accumulated judgment of the people who navigate it. That layered honesty, instead of a single tidy explanation, is closer to the actual state of scientific knowledge about this specific channel today. It's worth finishing the story of the people who first threaded this passage, because what happened to them afterward says something true about the specific kind of person this channel has always attracted. And it isn't a simple story of triumph. Frederick Cook, the Belgica's American physician, went on to build a career on daring, high-stakes polar claims, and in 1909 announced that he had reached the North Pole, a claim that unraveled under scrutiny within months, and that the overwhelming majority of historians now consider fabricated, a reputation that never recovered, and that Cook carried, disgraced, for the rest of his life. Roald Amundsen, the young Norwegian first mate who kept his composure through the Belgica's entire 13-month entrapment and later credited the experience with teaching him what polar survival actually required, went on to lead the first expedition to reach the South Pole in 1911, the first ship to complete a transit of the Northwest Passage, and in 1926, the first confirmed flight over the North Pole, aboard the airship Norge. He died in 1928, lost somewhere over the Barents Sea while searching for survivors of a rival expedition's crashed airship, a rescue mission he volunteered for despite having nothing left to prove and every reason to stay home. Adrien de Gerlache himself, the officer who first pushed the Belgica through the Narrows and then, weeks later, pushed the same ship into 13 months of pack ice, went on to a long career in Belgian polar and naval affairs, later helping organize his own son's Antarctic expedition decades afterward, a family relationship with these waters that outlasted his own sailing years by a full generation. And Karl Vinke, the young sailor swept overboard in a squall before the ship was ever beset, has his name on an island in the Strait de Gerlache, mapped that same season, a small, permanent marker for the one member of that crew who never got to tell his own version of what happened. 3 very different outcomes, from 3 men who stood on the same deck through the same ordeal. One man's reputation destroyed by his own later dishonesty, one man's career built into legend through decades of subsequent achievement and finally ended in a volunteer's death, and one man's name reduced permanently to a dot on a map because he didn't survive long enough to have a career at all. None of that was determined by the passage through Lemaire itself, but all 3 men made the same initial calculation that every captain following them into that channel has made since, that the specific, measurable risk in front of them was one worth taking, in exchange for what lay past it. Some of them kept making versions of that same calculation for the rest of their lives. In increasingly dangerous circumstances, right up until one of those calculations killed them. Charcot belongs in that same accounting, even though he sailed a different ship through Lemaire 5 and 10 years after the Belgica. He survived both of his own Antarctic expeditions, the retreat forced by ice and engine failure in 1903 and the successful winter at Petermann Island 5 years later, and went on to a long career as one of France's most respected polar scientists, eventually earning the nickname the Polar Gentleman for the meticulous, careful way he ran his ships compared to some of his more reckless contemporaries. That same careful captain died anyway, on September 16, 1936. Not in Antarctica at all, but off the coast of Iceland, when the Pourquoi Pas, the same ship that had carried him safely past Lemaire's Narrows a quarter century earlier, was caught in a violent storm on the return leg of a Greenland research voyage and wrecked on the reefs near Alpheness. Of the 40 men aboard, only one survived. Charcot's body was recovered and brought home to be buried in Montmartre Cemetery in Paris. The specific caution that had defined his entire Antarctic career, the caution that got his crew through the Lemaire Channel and back out again, twice, without loss, did not, in the end, protect him from a different ocean entirely, decades later, on a voyage that had nothing to do with ice at all. That pattern, more than any single fact about ice density or wind speed, is the real through line connecting the Belgica's first transit to the ship easing through the same Narrows this season, this week, possibly today. Caution reduces the risk, meaningfully and measurably, but the people who spend their whole working lives testing the edge of what the ocean will allow are, by the nature of that work, still testing it every single time, for as long as they keep choosing to go back out. None of the judgment described so far would matter much without the ships underneath it, so it's worth understanding what actually changed mechanically. Between de Gerlache forcing a converted Norwegian whaler through the Narrows in 1898 and a modern expedition vessel doing the same transit today, contemporary polar tourism ships are built and certified under a formal ice classification system, most commonly the Polar Class Scale, running from Polar Class 1 at the top, reserved for year-round operation in the very heaviest multi-year ice, down through Polar Class 7 at the lower end. Most vessels working the Antarctic Peninsula's tourist routes, including passages like Lemaire, sit around Polar Class 5 or 6, rated for year-round operation in medium first-year ice, with occasional older ice inclusions, which is a formal, tested way of saying the hull can absorb a certain amount of contact with exactly the kind of brash ice and bergy bits described earlier without structural failure. The steel in the ice belt around the waterline on these ships typically runs 25 to 30 millimeters thick in the most exposed sections, welded with continuous double seams rather than the spot welding used elsewhere on the hull, specifically because that band of the ship is the one most likely to make repeated, glancing contact with ice over the vessel's working life. Propulsion has changed just as much as the hull. A growing number of modern expedition ships use diesel-electric systems, driving azimuth thrusters, pod-mounted propulsors that can rotate independently through a full circle instead of relying on a fixed rudder and a single-direction propeller shaft, which translates directly into the kind of tight, responsive maneuvering a 600-meter-wide channel actually demands. Where de Gerlache had one engine, one propeller, and essentially one plan, if that engine or that propeller failed at the wrong moment, a modern polar-class vessel typically carries redundant propulsion and power generation specifically, so a single mechanical failure inside a place like Lemaire doesn't strand the ship the way engine trouble stranded Charcot's Français on its first attempt to push south through these same narrows in 1903. This is, in plain terms, the entire difference between what acceptable risk meant in the age of exploration and what it means now. The channel hasn't gotten any less narrow, the ice hasn't gotten any more predictable, and the wind still funnels the same way it always has. What's changed is that the ship absorbing that risk today is built, tested, and certified specifically to survive contact that would have ended the Belgica's or the Français voyage outright. Better engineering doesn't mean the underlying hazard has been solved, and the clearest, most sobering proof of that sits just north of Lemaire, close enough in both geography and kind that it belongs in this story even though, again, it didn't happen inside the channel itself. On November 23, 2007, the passenger vessel MS Explorer, a purpose-built expedition ship that had spent nearly 4 decades safely running Antarctic routes since its construction in 1969, struck ice in the early morning hours near the South Shetland Islands. Not far north of the approaches, every Lemaire-bound ship has to pass through first. The impact opened a gash in the hull that the crew could not control, and over the following 20 hours, as the ship's officers worked to keep her afloat long enough to get everyone off safely, all 154 people on board, passengers and crew together, were evacuated into lifeboats and life rafts in near-freezing conditions. A passing Norwegian cruise ship, the Nord Norge, reached the scene, took everyone aboard, and ferried them to a Chilean airbase on King George Island. Nobody died. Nobody was seriously injured, and the Explorer, a ship that had survived Antarctic ice for 38 years of continuous operation, sank to the bottom of the Southern Ocean that evening, the first and so far only passenger vessel in history to be lost specifically in Antarctic waters. That incident is worth sitting with for exactly what it does and doesn't prove. It doesn't prove that Antarctic tourism is unusually deadly, because it isn't, by the numbers, remotely close to it. Every person on that ship survived, thanks to a well-drilled crew, functioning safety equipment, and a nearby vessel that reached the scene fast enough to matter. And that outcome is a genuine credit to the safety culture the industry has built specifically because incidents like this remain a real, if rare, possibility. What it does prove, cleanly and without any need for exaggeration, is that struck ice remains, in the 21st century, on a well-built, experienced, professionally crewed ship, a sentence that can still end with the vessel at the bottom of the ocean. Every captain who eases a bow into the Lemaire Channel today is operating with that outcome sitting somewhere in the back of their calculation, not as an abstract statistic, but as a specific, documented event that happened to a real ship, on a real morning, less than a full day's sailing from the same Narrows. Part of what makes that back-of-the-mind calculation weigh as heavily as it does is just how far away real help actually is once a ship commits to this stretch of coast. And it's worth being plain about the timeline instead of leaving it vague. If something goes seriously wrong inside or near the Lemaire Channel, the nearest meaningful medical or logistical support generally runs through the airfield at the Chilean and Russian bases on King George Island, roughly a day's sailing north, depending on conditions, and even reaching that airfield doesn't guarantee a fast evacuation, since flights in and out depend entirely on weather that can close the runway for days at a stretch. Anything beyond what that airfield and its aircraft can handle, a serious injury requiring specialist care, for instance, generally means a sailing evacuation towards South America, or in some cases, all the way to New Zealand. A transit that industry medical guidance puts it somewhere between 5 and 8 days, depending on the departure point and the state of the sea. There is no Coast Guard cutter on permanent standby nearby. There is no hospital within helicopter range in the way there would be almost anywhere a cruise ship operates in temperate waters. The nearest sustained rescue capability, the kind that responded to the Explorer's sinking in 2007, exists mainly in the form of other ships already operating in the area at the same time, which is precisely why the informal network of shared ice reports and radio traffic mentioned earlier works as more than just a navigation convenience. It doubles, in a very real sense, as the region's closest thing to a rescue infrastructure. Everybody already out here, watching out for everybody else, because nobody else is close enough to do it for them. This is the part of the risk calculus that rarely gets spoken aloud on the bridge, because it doesn't need to be. Every captain and every Ipu ice pilot working this coast already carries the knowledge that a serious mistake inside the Lemaire Channel doesn't get solved in an hour by an ambulance and a nearby emergency room. It's the kind of problem that, in the worst case, has to be managed entirely with the resources already on board and whatever ship happens to be close enough to help for as long as it takes weather and distance to allow anything more to arrive. That reality doesn't make captains more reckless. If anything, everything described earlier, the conservative turnback rule when ice looks consolidated, the reduced speed, the extra lookouts, the entire architecture of shared reporting and polar code compliance exists specifically because the people running these ships understand exactly how far away the safety net actually is, and have built their entire operating culture around never needing to test it. The risk this channel presents doesn't sit still across the 5-month season either, and that's worth tracing the way you'd trace any other change in the landscape along this route. Because the word dangerous means something noticeably different in November than it does in March. Early in the season, when ships first start running the peninsula in November and into December, the channel tends to carry the heaviest accumulation of pack ice and fast ice left over from the Antarctic winter. Ice that hasn't yet had months of summer sun to break it down and clear it out, which means early season transits are the ones most likely to find Lemaire simply closed, wall to wall, with no workable lane at all. That's the condition behind the specific, documented account of one traveler who described, in her own record of a peninsula voyage, learning on arrival that the ship ahead of hers had been unable to complete the passage at all in the days before, the ice too thick to risk it. A first-hand report of exactly the kind of closure this whole story has been describing in the abstract. By January and February, the height of the Austral summer, the channel typically opens up considerably. And this is the window when most of the postcard calm, mirror water photography actually gets captured. The water clearer of pack ice, the days longest, the conditions closest to what the Kodak Gap nickname promises. But that same summer warmth is also driving the glacier fronts on both walls harder, more active melt, more frequent calving, which is exactly the mechanism behind the currents that build the iceberg garden south of the channel and the source of the fresh, hard-to-detect growlers breaking off into the water in the first place. Open water, in other words, doesn't mean ice-free water. It means a different kind of ice, generally less of the old consolidated pack that closes the channel outright, but a steadier supply of individual bergy bits, and growlers calved fresh off the walls, which is arguably a more insidious hazard for exactly the reason described earlier. Harder for radar to catch, harder to see against summer glare on the water. And, unlike a solid ice field, a captain can assess visually from a distance. Capable of appearing without warning from a glacier face, the ship has already passed. By March, as the season winds down and temperatures begin dropping again, the pattern starts reversing, new ice beginning to form at the margins. Fewer ships still running the route at all as operators wind down for the winter, daylight shrinking back toward the darkness that trapped the Belgica a century and a quarter earlier. There is no single safe month for Lemaire in any absolute sense. There's a shifting balance across the season between two different flavors of the same underlying hazard: consolidated pack ice that can close the channel outright versus scattered, fresh, hard-to-detect ice calved from actively melting walls. And every captain planning a season's worth of transits through these narrows is, whether they'd phrase it this way or not, managing a moving target that resets itself, in its own particular way, every few weeks, from November through March. It's easy to picture this whole story as being about large expedition cruise ships exclusively, because they carry the passengers and the cameras and the numbers that dominate the tourism statistics, but they aren't the only vessels making this same calculation against this same stretch of water. National research and supply vessels running missions along the peninsula, resupplying stations like Vernadsky, the American base at Palmer, or the British station at Rothera further south, use these same narrows when schedules and ice conditions allow, trading the same hours of open water detour for the same shortcut, under government rather than commercial pressure, but facing an identical bridge-level decision when they reach the ice field at False Cape Renard. And a smaller, less publicized population of private sailing yachts, increasingly active in Antarctic waters over the past 2 decades as blue water sailing culture has expanded into genuinely remote destinations, also runs this coast. Some of them ADO members operating under the same voluntary guidelines as the big cruise companies. Some of them independent operators with considerably less institutional support behind them if something goes wrong. A 40-foot sailing yacht attempting Lemaire carries none of the redundant propulsion, none of the ice-strengthened steel, and generally none of the professional ice pilot expertise that a Polar Class 5 expedition ship brings to the same water, which means the same channel that represents a carefully managed, well-resourced risk for a commercial operator can represent something considerably closer to a genuine gamble for a small private vessel, making the same transit on personal ambition instead of corporate infrastructure. That range, from a government icebreaker with a full ice navigation team on the bridge, down to a private yacht crewed by 2 or 3 experienced, but essentially self-supported sailors, is worth holding in mind, because it's a reminder that ships use this shortcut covers no single uniform category of risk-taking. It spans a whole spectrum of people making structurally the same decision, weighing the same 11 kilometers of narrow, glacier-walled water against the same hours saved and the same scenery gained, but doing so with wildly different amounts of engineering, training, and rescue capacity behind them, if that decision turns out to be wrong. The channel doesn't discriminate between them. The ice doesn't check a vessel's polar class rating before deciding whether to let it through cleanly or close in around it. Every one of them, from the 400-passenger cruise ship to the family aboard a private yacht flying a national ensign nobody in Antarctica particularly cares about, is betting the same 11 kilometers against the same underlying uncertainty. just with very different amounts of margin for being wrong. Go back, for a moment, to that morning in early February of 1898, the Belgica pressed between cliffs barely wider than 3 ship lengths. De Gerlache on the bridge, watching black rock close in on both sides of a channel nobody had ever named, because nobody had ever needed to. Everything this story has since laid out. The growlers that don't register on modern radar, the glacier walls that redraw the channel's width between one survey and the next, the katabatic gusts that can turn glass-calm water into whitecap chaos inside a few minutes. The charting gaps that still leave whole stretches of this coastline more thoroughly known by the people who sail it than by any published map. All of it was already true on that first crossing, just without instruments sophisticated enough to measure most of it, and without a name yet for the passage carrying it. De Gerlache didn't have sonar readings warning him about growlers. He had a lookout with a good pair of eyes and a captain's willingness to trust his own judgment. Past the point most people would have turned back. 3 weeks later, that same willingness carried his ship 90 miles into pack ice it couldn't escape and kept it there for 13 months. The instinct that took the Belgica through Lemaire and the instinct that then trapped it in the pack were never two separate things. They were the same instinct, applied twice, in quick succession, with wildly different outcomes. And that's the honest shape of what every captain following de Gerlache into this channel has been managing ever since, whether they think about it in those terms or not. The Lemaire Channel rewards exactly the kind of calculated boldness that, taken one step further, without the safeguards that 125 years of accumulated hard-won caution have since built around it, destroyed the very expedition that first proved the channel could be crossed at all. Modern captains inherit both halves of that lesson. They inherit the confidence to attempt the narrows in the first place, and they inherit, built directly into Polar Code requirements, IAATO guidelines, ice-strengthened hulls, and a culture that treats turning back as a routine professional decision instead of a failure. The hard discipline that de Gerlache's crew had to learn the much harder way, trapped in the ice for a winter nobody had planned for. Some of the gap between what's known and what isn't has genuinely narrowed in recent years, and it's worth giving that its due, rather than leaving the impression that nothing has changed since de Gerlache navigated by eyesight alone. Satellite radar imagery, drawn from systems capable of imaging sea ice regardless of cloud cover or darkness, now gets processed into ice charts that expedition operators can access on a rolling basis, sometimes within hours of a fresh pass over the peninsula, giving captains a regional picture of pack ice distribution well before their ship is anywhere near enough to see it directly. That's a genuine improvement over the purely ship-to-ship radio network described earlier. And it's part of why serious ice closures, the kind that leave a channel completely impassable for days, catch operators by surprise. Less often than they once did, but satellite imagery at the resolution currently available to most operators is still built for regional pack ice distribution, not for spotting an individual growler riding low in open water inside an 11-kilometer channel, which means the tool has narrowed one specific kind of uncertainty, whether the channel is broadly open or broadly closed, while leaving almost untouched the finer-grained uncertainty that actually determines whether a specific transit on a specific morning encounters a specific piece of nearly invisible ice in exactly the wrong place. Better information at one scale hasn't yet translated into better information at the other. And that gap between the two is, again, precisely where the remaining danger concentrates. It's worth saying plainly, though, alongside all of this, that the overwhelming majority of transits through Lemaire end exactly the way they're supposed to, uneventfully, beautifully, with passengers photographing mirror water and returning home with a story about scenery instead of survival. The channel's dangerous reputation among the people who actually navigate it doesn't come from frequent disaster, because frequent disaster, if it existed, would have ended commercial use of this route decades ago under any reasonable regulatory or insurance framework. It comes instead from the specific, persistent, well-documented character of the risk that remains after everything reasonably manageable has already been managed. The low probability, high consequence tale where charting gaps, radar-resistant ice, and sudden wind can still combine, on the wrong day, against even a well-built ship and an experienced crew. That's a genuinely different claim than saying the channel is likely to end badly for any given ship on any given transit. And conflating the two would misrepresent what the actual record shows. Most days, the danger stays exactly where it belongs. In the disciplined, continuous background vigilance of the people managing it, instead of in any outcome passengers ever see or feel. There's a version of this same calculation happening below deck too, among the passengers. And it's worth acknowledging because the choice to accept this risk isn't made by captains alone. Expedition staff on these voyages brief guests before every landing and every notable transit, and the Lemaire Channel gets its own particular version of that briefing, one that tends to be almost entirely about wonder, framing what's coming as one of the visual highlights of the entire voyage, while including, usually as a brief, matter-of-fact aside, the honest caveat that the passage depends on ice conditions and might not be possible that day. Passengers rarely push back on that framing, or ask for more detail about what depends on ice conditions actually covers, and it would probably feel strange, even intrusive, if a cruise director stood in front of a lounge full of paying guests and walked them through growler radar signatures and katabatic wind speeds before breakfast. But the acceptance is still there underneath the excitement in a quieter form. People who signed up for this voyage specifically because it promised access to a genuinely remote, difficult, consequential piece of ocean, and who trust, correctly in the overwhelming majority of cases, that the professionals responsible for getting them through it have already done the harder thinking on their behalf. That trust is, in its own way, the final link in the same chain of decisions this whole story has been tracing since the Belgica first forced its way through in 1898. De Gerlache decided the risk was worth it, based on his own judgment and nobody else's. A modern captain decides the same thing today, but inside a structure of regulation, engineering, and shared information that de Gerlache never had. And a modern passenger leaning against the rail as the ship eases past False Cape Renard into water that looks, for all the world, like the safest, calmest place on the entire itinerary, is making a smaller, quieter version of that same bet, mostly without realizing it's a bet at all. 3 different scales of the identical calculation separated by more than a century, all resting on the same underlying trade, a narrow, genuinely dangerous passage, accepted in exchange for something on the other side of it that felt, to everyone who made the choice, worth crossing it for. There's one more mechanism worth understanding properly before pulling this whole story together, because it's the hazard most likely to surprise someone who assumes an iceberg, once calved and floating, is basically a stationary, predictable obstacle. It isn't. A berg that breaks free from a glacier face along the Lemaire's walls begins melting immediately, both from warmer surface water at the waterline and from below, where deeper currents can erode the submerged mass, roughly 90% of an iceberg's total bulk, far faster or more unevenly than the visible portion above the surface. As that underwater erosion proceeds, the berg's center of gravity shifts, sometimes gradually, sometimes very suddenly, and a piece of ice that had been sitting stably in the water for days or weeks can, without warning, roll, flipping to a new equilibrium position as the balance of its mass changes. A large berg rolling generates a genuine wave, sometimes a significant one, radiating outward across water that a moment earlier had looked completely settled. And it's precisely why expedition guides train to keep both ships and zodiacs a healthy working distance from any iceberg, regardless of how calm and inert it appears to be sitting there. The visible 90% rule, The fact that most of a berg's mass sits invisible beneath the waterline is common enough trivia that most passengers have heard some version of it before their trip even begins. What's less commonly understood is that the invisible 90% isn't just larger, it's actively changing shape and position the entire time the berg sits in the water, which means the visible, photogenic 10% above the surface can shift, tilt, or flip with essentially no warning legible from the deck of a passing ship. Layer that hazard on top of everything already covered: the growler's radar struggles to catch, the katabatic gusts that arrive with no buildup, the glacier walls that redraw the channel's width between surveys, and a clearer picture starts to form of why this specific 11 kilometers of water demands the kind of continuous, trained vigilance described throughout this whole story, rather than a one-time risk assessment made at the northern entrance and then set aside. Nothing inside the Lemaire Channel stays still for the length of a full transit. Not the ice, not the wind, not even the individual bergs that look, from a distance, like the most permanent and predictable objects in the entire scene. The channel's danger never sits still as a fixed quantity a captain measures once and checks off. It's a condition that has to be reassessed in some meaningful sense every few minutes for the entire 2 hours it takes to clear the Narrows, because the specific combination of hazards present at the northern entrance is never quite guaranteed to be the same combination still present by the time the ship reaches the southern exit. There's a sensory dimension to all of this that's easy to skip past in favor of the mechanics, and it's worth returning to because it's part of what makes the channel register as dangerous to the people inside it, even before anything actually goes wrong. Sound behaves differently in Lemaire than it does almost anywhere else on a typical Antarctic itinerary, precisely because of the same steep, close walls that create the navigational hazard in the first place. Engine noise, the crack and groan of ice working against the hull, even conversation on deck. All of it reflects off cliff faces less than a few hundred meters away in places, arriving back at the ship with a faint delay that most passengers register only as a vague, unplaceable sense that the space feels smaller, more enclosed than open water ever does. Glacier calving carries its own acoustic signature too. A sound guides learn to listen for specifically, often described as somewhere between a rifle crack and a long, rolling thunder, arriving audibly across the water before the visible collapse of ice into the sea even registers to the eye, giving trained ears a few extra seconds of warning that trained eyes alone might miss. That acoustic enclosure is, in its own way, the emotional signature of the whole channel, the physical sensation underneath everything else this story has described. It's the reason passengers report an unprompted hush settling over the deck, the reason the water red is safer than it necessarily is, the reason the walls feel close enough to touch even from the height of an observation deck several stories above the waterline. Sound, more than sight, is what tells a human body it has entered someplace fundamentally different from open ocean, someplace where the normal rules about distance and safety margin have visibly, audibly narrowed. De Gerlach's crew, without engines built to modern standards and without a hull designed to muffle any of it, would have heard that enclosure even more starkly than a passenger on a modern ship does today. The Belgica's own machinery bouncing back off rock that, until 3 weeks earlier, had never reflected the sound of any ship at all. It's worth putting the channel's actual size against the scale of the continent it belongs to, because the disproportion is almost comic once you actually look at it squarely. Antarctica's coastline is enormous by any measure, and it happens to be a textbook example of what mathematicians call the coastline paradox, the well-documented fact that a coastline's measured length isn't a fixed objective number at all, but depends heavily on the scale of measurement used, since a jagged, ice-fractured shore like Antarctica's keeps revealing more inlets, more bays, more fine detail the closer and more precisely you measure it, in a way a smooth stretch of open beach simply doesn't. Estimates for Antarctica's total coastline vary by a significant margin depending on which measurement standard is applied. And that variability reflects a genuine, mathematically understood property of trying to measure something this irregular at all. Against a coastline that resists being pinned down to a single number under the best conditions, the Lemaire Channel's 11 kilometers is a rounding error, a sliver too small to register as anything but noise against the scale of the whole continent. And yet, against that near-total statistical invisibility, this single sliver of water has come to represent more than almost any other single location on the continent, what the words Antarctic scenery actually conjure in most people's minds who've never been there. Open a coffee table book about Antarctica, scroll a tourism company's marketing feed, search for stock photography of the continent, and Lemaire's cliffs and mirror water turn up again and again, wildly overrepresented relative to its actual footprint on the map, precisely because of the qualities this whole story has been tracing from the start. The enclosure, the stillness, the drama of ice and rock pressed close enough together to frame a single, unforgettable photograph in a way that open, featureless pack ice or a distant ice shelf simply can't. The channel is dangerous in large part because it's narrow, and it's famous in large part for exactly the same reason. Those two facts aren't in tension with each other. They're the same fact, described from two different angles, and neither one makes sense without the other standing right behind it. Given everything already described about how far away real rescue capacity actually sits, it's not surprising that the industry has built its own financial backstop directly into the boarding process. Reputable Antarctic operators require passengers to carry travel insurance that specifically covers medical evacuation and repatriation before they're allowed on board at all. A policy requirement rather than a suggestion, precisely because a serious medical emergency this far from a hospital can generate evacuation costs, running into the tens of thousands of dollars once aircraft, fuel, and specialized transport are all accounted for. It's a small, unglamorous detail next to glacier walls and growlers, but it belongs in this story anyway because it's the plainest evidence that everyone involved in running these voyages, not just the captain on the bridge, has already priced in the specific, genuine possibility that something could go wrong far from any conventional help, and has built a financial structure around that possibility instead of simply hoping it never comes due. It's worth understanding, too, how tightly managed the whole system becomes once a ship actually clears Lemaire and reaches the landing sites the channel exists to unlock, because the discipline doesn't stop at the bridge. The International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators requires member vessels to maintain a guide-to-visitor ratio of one trained staff member for every 20 passengers ashore. For interest, backed by a rule that caps any single landing at 100 people on the ground at a time, and a further rule that only one ship may visit a given site at all during any given window, so the small, dramatic landing beaches around Peterman Island or Booth Island never see the kind of crowding that would stress either the wildlife or the safety margins the whole operation depends on. Those numbers aren't incidental. They're the same underlying philosophy that governs the transit through the channel itself, extended onto land. Limit exposure, keep trained eyes on every small group, and build enough redundancy into the system that a single bad call by one guide, one captain, or one passenger doesn't cascade into something worse. The guides making those judgment calls ashore are frequently the same expedition staff who help assess ice conditions from the bridge on the way in. Naturalists, former ship's officers, and polar scientists whose expertise gets applied continuously across the whole voyage, not switched on only for the parts that look dangerous on paper. It's worth naming the ships that never even attempt this calculation at all, too, because their absence from the channel says almost as much as everyone else's presence in it. A number of much larger vessels also operate scenic voyages in Antarctic waters each season, ocean-going ships carrying passenger counts well beyond the 500-person landing threshold that keeps them from putting guests ashore anywhere on the continent, built for comfort and stability, rather than the tight, responsive handling a narrow channel demands. For these ships, Lemaire simply isn't part of the conversation, not because of caution about ice or wind, but because of plain physical arithmetic. A vessel with a beam and a turning radius suited to open ocean has no business testing itself against a 600-meter gap between rock walls, regardless of how clear the ice happens to be that day. These larger ships stick to the wider water, the Lemaire Strait, the Bransfield Strait, offering their passengers a real and often genuinely striking view of the peninsula's coastline from a comfortable distance, without ever threading the specific narrows that give the smaller expedition fleet its signature photograph. That split in the fleet is a useful, concrete way to see the whole risk calculation from outside it for a moment. The Lemaire Channel doesn't stand as a hazard every Antarctic-bound ship has to reckon with. It's a specific, optional wager that only the smaller, purpose-built, ice-classed expedition vessels are even in a position to consider taking. And the fact that so many of them choose to take it anyway, season after season, instead of playing it uniformly safe the way the larger ships do by simple design, is itself a kind of evidence. It tells you that the operators who built their entire business model around small, maneuverable, ice-strengthened ships did so, at least in part, because access to exactly this kind of narrow, consequential water is what their specific segment of the industry is actually selling, a trade-off between vessel size and destination access that these companies made deliberately with open eyes, long before any individual captain ever has to make the smaller version of the same choice on any specific morning. So pull all of it together, the way you'd have to if someone stopped you halfway through this and asked plainly, what actually makes the Lemaire Channel the most dangerous maritime shortcut into Antarctic waters? Because by now, the answer has enough parts that it's worth stating cleanly, one more time, in a single place. It isn't any single hazard working alone. It's narrowness, a passage that in places closes to something around 600 meters between glacier-topped cliffs rising more than 700 meters straight from the water, leaving a ship with almost no room to maneuver around whatever it encounters. It's ice that comes in a form modern instruments still struggle to reliably detect, growlers riding low and dense and nearly invisible to both eye and radar, inside a channel too tight to simply steer wide around them the way a ship could in open water. It's wind funneled by exactly the same walls that create the narrowness, capable of turning glass-calm water into sustained gusts approaching 80 knots within minutes, and with essentially no warning. It's charts that, however good the main channel's own record has become through a century and a quarter of accumulated transits, still sit inside a broader region of Antarctic coastal water that remains, by any honest measure, incompletely surveyed. A gap recent discoveries elsewhere on this same coastline have demonstrated is still very much live instead of historical. It's a rescue infrastructure that, if something does go wrong, measures its response time in days instead of minutes, leaving nearby ships as the closest thing to a safety net most transits actually have. And it's all of that, stacked into a single working shortcut that more than 100,000 people a year are now choosing to cross, deliberately, on a fixed commercial schedule. Because the alternative costs hours, the industry has built its entire business model around not losing. And because the water on the other side of that risk remains, on a clear day, a place many of these travelers will remember as the single most beautiful stretch of the entire voyage. No other regularly used approach into Antarctic waters combines that particular stack of hazards. In that particular concentration, inside that narrow a stretch of water, used that routinely by that wide a range of vessels, with that little rescue capacity standing behind it. That's not a claim about body counts or shipwreck totals. It's a claim about the specific compounding architecture of risk built into a single 11-kilometer passage that ships keep choosing anyway. And it's the honest, fully earned shape of the superlative this whole story set out at the very beginning to test rather than simply assert. It's worth being just as precise at the end of this about what actually got resolved along the way and what genuinely didn't. Because that's the difference this whole story has tried to hold on to, without blurring it for the sake of a tidier ending. What's resolved? The channel's basic geography, its history, the identity of the people who first forced a ship through it, and what happened to them afterward. The categories of ice that threaten a hull and why growlers specifically evade easy detection. The mechanism behind katabatic wind, and why a channel this shape amplifies it. The documented regional incidents at Bahia Paraíso, at Wilhelmina Bay, and the loss of the Explorer, each of them real, each of them traceable to a specific date and a specific outcome. What's resolved, too, is the basic shape of why ships keep choosing this route anyway. The hours saved, the scenery gained, the regulatory and engineering structure that has turned an explorer's gamble into a managed commercial risk over a century and a quarter of accumulated caution. What isn't resolved, and what this story has tried not to pretend otherwise about, is the fine-grained mechanism underneath the channel's most distinctive behavior, the exact current patterns that gather ice into the iceberg garden south of the Narrows and release it on no fully documented schedule, the precise day-by-day interaction between glacier calving, tide, and wind that determines whether a specific morning's transit meets open water or a wall of pack ice, and the exact rate at which the regional warming trend is reshaping this specific channel's width over decades, a trend whose broader direction is well established even though nobody has yet published the number that would pin it down for Lemaire alone. Nobody currently navigating this channel, however experienced, would claim to have solved that finer layer of uncertainty. What they'd claim, more honestly, is that they've learned to operate carefully enough inside it, watching for what the evidence can tell them in the moment, instead of pretending to a certainty the water has never actually offered anyone. Not de Gerlach in 1898, and not the captain standing on a bridge approaching false Cape Renard this season. Picture the ship one more time. Not the Belgica now, but whichever expedition vessel happens to be approaching false Cape Renard on the morning this reaches you, because somewhere in the world, during roughly 5 months of every year, that ship exists, right now or very soon, idling at the northern mouth of the channel, while someone on the bridge studies the ice ahead through binoculars. They have satellite imagery from the last clear pass, radio reports from whichever vessel ran this water yesterday, a hull rated for exactly this kind of contact, redundant engines, a trained eye for the specific gray-green sheen that separates a harmless bergy bit from a hull-opening growler, and a full century and a quarter of accumulated institutional caution standing behind every decision they're about to make. They also have, no matter how much of that has improved since 1898, a channel that still won't tell them with certainty what the next 2 hours actually hold, walls that might have shifted since the last chart update, wind that could still turn without warning, water whose exact currents nobody has ever fully mapped. They look at what they can see. They weigh it against what they can't. And then, more often than not, because the ice looks workable and the wind is holding and the light is doing something extraordinary against the cliffs, they give the order, and the ship eases forward into the Narrows. The same calculated bet de Gerlache made first, the same one every captain since has made in their own way, carrying passengers toward 2 hours of mirror water, glacier walls, and the specific earned, honestly uncertain kind of danger that has made this 11-kilometer gap in the rock the most consequential shortcut on the entire Antarctic peninsula, precisely because everyone who crosses it, from the bridge to the observation deck, understands at some level exactly what they're choosing to risk and chooses to risk it anyway. There's a question worth sitting with after all of this, and it isn't really about Antarctica at all. Every one of us makes some smaller version of the same trade de Gerlache made in 1898, or the one that Captain approaching False Cape Renard is weighing right now somewhere in the world while you're hearing this. A narrow, uncertain passage on one side, something genuinely worth reaching on the other, and never quite enough information to make the choice feel fully safe before you commit to it anyway. Most of those choices don't involve glaciers or growlers. They still ask the same basic question. So here's mine for you, and I'd genuinely like to know the answer. If you were standing on that bridge, ice ahead, the lane looking maybe 80% clear, the light doing something you'd never forgive yourself for missing, what would you do? Would you take the shortcut, or would you play it safe and go the long way around? Tell me in the comments honestly, not the answer you think sounds brave, the one you'd actually make. I read every one of them. And this particular question, I have a feeling, is going to split people right down the middle. If a story like this, one that tries to hold the danger and the beauty of a place like this in the same hand without flinching from either, is the kind of thing you want more of, the like button is right there, and it genuinely helps this reach the people who'd want to see it just as much as you did. Subscribe if you want to keep tracing routes like this one. West Talmike to Busquesquacion, the real, dangerous, still not fully mapped corners of this planet, told with the same respect for uncertainty that the people who actually navigate them have to carry every single day. There's a lot more coastline like this left to cover, and I'd like you along for it. Until then, stay curious about the places that don't give up their answers easily, because the Lemaire proves better than almost anywhere else on Earth that those are usually the ones most worth the risk of finding out.